Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Monsters Manifested, right here on DM Tools with MaxMcCool. On today's episode, we're going to be continuing our journey through the Devil monster type with the Chain Devil. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. The Chain Devil's stat block can be found on page 72 of the Monster Manual, and its lore can be found on page 68. So, let's begin there. Chain Devil, also known as Chiton. This ominous fiend wears chains like a shroud. Driving lesser creatures before it with its fearsome gaze, a chain devil animates the chains that cover its body as well as inanimate chains nearby, which sprout hooks, blades, and spikes to eviscerate enemies. Chain devils act as sadistic jailers and torturers in the infernal realms, relishing pain and living to inflict it upon others. They are called on to torment mortal souls trapped in the nine hells, inflicting their sadistic fury on the horrid lemures in which those souls manifest. And that's all there is when it comes to the lore and description of a chain devil. Fairly straightforward, which seems to be a going theme for these lesser devils in the Monster Manual, but I think that there's still some information there that could be put to use, especially in the way that it's presented within its role amongst the hierarchy of devils. Not too much on their behavior patterns or their disposition, how they think, their desires or likes and dislikes. Really, this seems to be more of just like an occupational explanation of chain devils, which is not without value, so we'll see what we can develop implementing that as part of what we keep in mind when we create adventures utilizing the chain devil as our monster. But before we get into all of that, let's move on to the stat block. The chain devil is a medium fiend devil with a lawful evil alignment. It has an armor class of 16, which is natural armor. It has hit points that average 85 or 10d8 plus 40, and it has a movement speed of 30 feet. The Chain Devil has a strength of 18, a dexterity of 15, a constitution of 18, an intelligence of 11, a wisdom of 12, and a charisma of 14. Its saving throws include constitution plus 7, wisdom plus 4, and charisma plus 5. It is resistant to the damage types of cold, bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing from non-magical weapons that are not silvered. The Chain Devil is also immune to the damage types of fire and poisoned, as well as being immune to the poisoned condition. It has the senses of dark vision for 120 feet and a passive perception of 11. The Chain Devil speaks the languages of infernal and telepathy for 120 feet and is a challenge rating of 8. On to the abilities. Devil's Sight. Magical darkness does not impede the devil's dark vision. And Magic Resistance. The devil has advantage on saving throws against spells and other magical effects. On to the actions. Multi-attack. The devil makes 2 attacks with its chains. Chain is a melee weapon attack with a plus 8 to hit, a reach of 10 feet on one target. On a hit, it does an average of 11 or 2d6 plus 4 slashing damage. The target is grappled with an escape DC of 14 if the devil isn't already grappling another creature. Until this grapple ends, the target is restrained and takes an average of 7 or 2d6 piercing damage at the start of each of its turns. And Animate Chains, which recharges after a short or a long rest. Up to 4 chains the devil can see within 60 feet of it magically sprout razor-edged barbs and animate under the devil's control, provided that the chains aren't being worn or carried. Each animated chain is an object with an AC of 20, 20 hit points, and resistance to piercing damage and immunity to psychic and thunder damage. When the devil uses multi-attack on its turn, it can use each animated chain to make 1 additional chain attack. An animated chain can grapple 1 creature of its own, but cannot make attacks while grappling. An animated chain reverts to its inanimate state if reduced to 0 hit points or if the devil is incapacitated or dies. And finally, onto the reaction. Unnerving Mask. When a creature the devil can see starts its turn within 30 feet of the devil can create the illusion that it looks like one of the creature's departed loved ones or bitter enemies. If the creature can see the devil, it must succeed on a DC 14 wisdom saving throw or be frightened until the end of its turn. And that's all there is when it comes to the stats of the Chain Devil. So once again, as I had previously mentioned, this seems to be a recurring theme when it comes to the lore description and stats of these different types of devils, very similar in the way that demons were presented, where they had a large expanse of information for the realm and the behavior patterns of these types of monsters as a whole, and then relatively short and sweet descriptions or expositions on the specific types of individual monsters and how they behave. But that's fine. I think that we can still utilize the information that's provided to us with the lore and the stats of these creatures and come up with something that may be compelling or interesting, or at the very least, a fun time for the people at our table. So without further ado, let's move on to some adventure crafting. Okay, so the first thing that comes to mind for me when thinking of the Chain Devil and how to utilize it as the spotlight monster for our adventures, I actually lean more towards the unnerving mask reaction that it has. That seems really interesting and compelling to me, and I think that it could be utilized in such a way that we could implement a Chain Devil in our adventure as the monster or creature for our party to contend with, without it being necessarily as standard as the lore may describe it, where the Chain Devil behaves as this sort of interrogator, torturer, jailer type of individual within the Nine Hells, although that can be utilized as well, which I will cover a little later on down the line. But as a knee-jerk response, seeing that unnerving mask and what it does leads me to think of an adventure where this Chain Devil is presented as a type of lure for the party. So in the description of the unnerving mask ability of the Chain Devil, it can take on the visage of either a loved one of a member of the party, or anyone really, but either a loved one or a mortal enemy. And I think that that can be utilized to lure your party, or at least one member of the party, in which presumably the rest of the party will follow, into all sorts of troublesome and dangerous scenarios. So imagine, if you would, an instance where perhaps the party has spent a night of revelry or something like that within the inn of a town or the tavern in a city, and as they make their way out of this establishment and are sort of doing the 45 shuffle towards their room or wherever their next destination is, out of the corner of one of their eyes, they see someone that they recognize, and that person either calls upon them or waves them over or performs some sort of action to try and convince them to follow them into a dark alley, maybe into a cellar or something like that, in which this location may house perhaps a larger chamber or network of chambers, perhaps an underground pathway, something like that, in which the players have to then navigate their way through this system and possibly contend with other monsters, other creatures. Maybe you could utilize something more thematic, like them hearing the voice of their loved one that they spotted, or of the mortal enemy taunting them, leading them deeper and deeper into the depths of this environment or of this structure or system, and trying to get them into this final spot where they can be entrapped or accosted by the Chain Devil. And I think in that you could utilize a variety of monsters. You wouldn't necessarily have to utilize solely devils, as the players are making their way throughout this system, this underground network, or this collapsed dungeon, or this underground system of tunnels that maybe was used originally as, who knows, right? It could be rum runners, could be an underground network of sorts for transporting resources and materials, weapons, anything like that. And now it is utilized by this Chain Devil in order to coax people into venturing the depths of this area so that it can capture them and torture them and harvest their souls to send to the Nine Hells. And I think that you could develop something interesting there depending on the way you chose to go about it. So you could have a scenario where perhaps the party is on the tail or on the heels of this enemy that escaped them, and they're chasing after them, and their last known location, or the last they heard or saw this individual, they ran into this settlement or this town or this city. And so they're in there sort of investigating and trying to do some reconnaissance to figure out where this individual is hiding. They spot the individual in an alley or something like that, and they charge after them, and they're effectively just led into this trap. You could also have an instance where perhaps one of the party members, and if not one of the party members, perhaps an NPC, has given them a mission or charged them with the task of finding and recovering a missing loved one. And in that, then you could have the party see the visage of this loved one present in an alleyway or perhaps in the middle of the town square, and they run off, and the party has to try to catch up to them and see if they can interact with them. And they're again led into this sort of mousetrap of sorts, in where they have to contend with the chain devil at the end of it all. Another way that you can utilize a chain devil is exactly as stated in the lore, in that it behaves as a sort of torturer or interrogator or jailer, or any combination of those three things. And I think that that could be implemented in many intriguing ways, or a variety of intriguing ways, dependent on the how of the matter, or the who, I suppose, where you could have something to the effect of a scenario where your players are driven to the nine hells and they are traversing through the plains, and they encounter an infernal prison or jail where it's housed mostly by these lesser devils and lost souls that are being tortured and violated by the chain devils. You could also implement something less straightforward, where these chain devils are behaving as the jailers or the interrogators for another organization, and the deal is that the chain devil provides its efficient and effective methods on prisoners of interest, people of interest, individuals of some sort of value to this other organization. And the trade-off there is that the organization or group of individuals gets the resources or information or materials or whatever it is that they want, and the chain devil gets the souls of the targeted prisoners, as well as of the individuals that struck the deal with it in the first place, of course. So in that, you could have perhaps a dark underbelly, a seedy thieves guild, something to that effect, where the proprietor or the head of the guild, or perhaps even the original founders of the guild, had struck a deal with a devil and utilized the powers and capabilities of the chain devil to extract information, resources from certain people of interest or prisoners that they had. You could use information such as perhaps they were interrogating a person of interest that knew the location of a hidden treasure or a lost relic. Perhaps they were interrogating an individual who they caught running through those previously mentioned rum running tunnels or anything like that, underground transport tunnel systems, anything of that nature, with a large sum of resources or weaponry or armor, perhaps some sort of magical item, and they manage to apprehend this individual and are interrogating them to see when the next drop or transport is going to be, so that they can intervene and take the items or resources, materials for themselves in order to bolster their strength and value as a guild. And you can have that even be the driving force for your adventure, where it's something to the effect of a rescue mission, and somebody has asked the party to seek out this lost individual or this person who went missing and try to rescue them from wherever it is they may be. Maybe just make sure that they're alive. Maybe see if they went into business for themselves and took the money and ran, as it were, in order to sort of disappear and ride off into the sunset with one big score. Like they might have screwed over the individuals transporting these things by saying that they would be the carrier, that they would be the mule, and then they ran off. So everyone thinks that that's what they did, was they turned tail or double-crossed them and ran off, when in fact they've been kidnapped and apprehended and are currently being accosted by this guild and a chain devil. That could even be, in fact, the driving motivation for the quest. perhaps it's a vengeance quest, let's say, where the quest giver believes that to be the case. And so the party is sent off to find this individual and do away with them and collect the treasure and bring it back to that person. And then as they get to that point and stumble upon the location of the individual, they see that that actually is not what went down. The individual was apprehended and is now being tortured and punished by the guild and this chain devil in order to extract some more information on when the next shipment will be coming. I think that any adventure within that kind of framework could be utilized to pretty good effect for a quick adventure to drop into your campaign, even if you were to just utilize it as a side quest or perhaps an introduction into a guild or this sort of influence that the devils of the nine hells have on the material plane. And I think that you can go a lot of different ways with it, and all of those ways could prove to be fairly fun to play and interesting for your players to sort of unravel and figure out what's going on. Finally, another way that I could see a chain devil being used is in that it stands guard. So this is sort of a spin-off of the jailer concept, where rather than it being a jailer for lost souls or even individuals on the material plane and behaving as interrogator and executioner, if you would, the chain devils behave as guards to the entrance of a place of significance. So you could have chain devils holding vigil outside of the entryway to a prison cell, or perhaps to a portal into the nine hells, specifically a portal that leads to the lair that has the largest prison in the nine hells. You could have them stand guard to the largest prison, or perhaps a wing of the largest prison on the material plane, and individuals are not allowed in and out of that location, and it's the job of the chain devils to make sure that nobody gets in and nobody gets out, as well as enact their specialties, let's say, upon the inmates within. Now, the reasoning you may have for that could be that perhaps the warden, much like the Thieves Guild, made a deal with a devil in order to house perhaps the worst of the worst villains and ne'er-do-wells in the lands or among the realms, right? So you could have this sort of medieval fantasy supermax prison that houses evil necromancers or liches, mad mages, perhaps warlords, tyrants, just cruel bestial individuals. You could even have locations in that prison where they house perhaps a lich or a death knight. And although the souls of those individuals might not be available to the devils of the nine hells, it's sort of part and parcel of the deal, because anything beyond that threshold, anything beyond that doorway which the chain devils guard, is under their responsibility to maintain. And I think that you could create an interesting encounter there where it might not even necessarily lead to combat with these chain devil monsters, but it'll certainly have your players curious as to what lies behind their doors and why an individual or a group of individuals would find it worthwhile to strike a deal with a devil in order to simply have some form of security around this wing of this supermax prison in a medieval fantasy world. All in all, though, the Chain Devil is a pretty cool monster in my opinion, although it is a little sort of standard fare and short and sweet. The unnerving mask reaction that it has, I found to be very inspirational in terms of giving me a spot to start when developing a concept for an adventure that we could utilize. That is super cool. The ability that it has to animate chains is also pretty cool in that it can utilize random chains around the environment as weapons. And I didn't touch too much on those or that action because I think that it's pretty evident that that requires the Chain Devil to be in a location or a locale where chains are readily available or prevalent, which you could implement to your own desire if you wanted something to that effect, right? So going the route of the prison, perhaps the cell or the interrogation room is just loaded up with chains hanging off the walls or the ceilings, stuff like that, the chains that hold up the chandeliers or the torches that illuminate the chamber. You can utilize those inanimate environmental chains as you like and sort of pop them into your adventure as you see fit. You could utilize them as sort of a means to continuously goad on your players. The chains start moving and waving and directing the players towards a certain room, almost as though they're pointing them towards their final destination, stuff like that. So the animating chains ability is cool and interesting and can be utilized, but I didn't find it as beneficial in terms of developing an idea around them. Whereas the unnerving mask to me immediately led me to the idea of hoodwinking the players or the party into believing that they have found this lost loved one or this mortal enemy and are now in pursuit of them, only to have the bait and switch take place where they're now contesting with the Chain Devil instead. But that's all I got for you fine folks today when it comes to the Chain Devil and how we could utilize it in some adventures. In the next episode of Monsters Manifested, we're going to be covering the Erinyes. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. And I think it should be a cool one. I think it should be pretty interesting. They appear to be a lot more martial or militaristic, almost as though they are the warriors, if you would, of the Nine Hells. A lot of plate armor and grisly-looking weapons. So that should be a cool one to dive into and see what we can make with the information that the Monster Manual gives to us. But until then, I'd like to thank you all very much for tuning in. I highly appreciate it. Please feel free to like the podcast, follow the podcast, rate the podcast, share the podcast, leave a review if you'd like. Let me know what you like, what you don't like, what you would like to hear more of, what you would like to hear less of. Anything like that, as the feedback would be greatly appreciated and it would help me out quite a bit. If you're listening to this episode of Monsters Manifested on YouTube, I'd kindly ask that you like, comment, subscribe, share, hit that notification bell, all those magic buttons that do amazing things apparently, as it would help the channel out, help the podcast out, help it grow, help it get to the ears of more people who may need some assistance in developing a campaign or an adventure, or are just having some trouble getting those creative juices flowing, and this might be a good launching pad for them, or a starting off point for them to come up with ideas utilizing these monsters or any other monsters that they would like to utilize, or for any new up and coming budding DMs and GMs that may want to get their feet wet and get started with a couple of adventures for a group of friends or people that they want to play a tabletop RPG with, but are not sure where to start or feel a little overwhelmed, and may be able to utilize this podcast as a resource for how to begin coming up with concepts and ideas for adventures at the table. But with all that being said, thank you all very much once again. I'm MaxMcCool, and I'll see you on the next one. Have a good day, everyone.